Exodus 19:1. On the third new moon, after the people of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. They set out on Rephidim and came into the wilderness of Sinai, and they encamped in the wilderness. There Israel encamped before the mountain. While Moses went up to God, the Lord called him out of the mountain, saying, "This you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel." Well, if I asked you, what is the most important thing that you could know in life, what would you say? Okay. Listen, all right, let me get through this, okay? Great answer. But theoretically, hypothetically, right? If you could have all the knowledge about one thing other than Jesus, actually, that's the point of where I'm going, so you already ruined it. But maybe you would say, if I could know everything there is to know about science, then maybe I could cure cancer. Maybe you would say, if I can know everything about money and the stock market, then I could set myself up for life. Some of you have a lot of knowledge about a lot of things, and the reality is that all of us, whether we realize it or not, are always striving to gain knowledge, whether we're actually attempting to or not. I mean, you think about it. There's things that we know that probably we have spent too much time trying to get to know. So some of you probably can name every player on the Dallas Cowboys. You can name their position. You can name where they went to school. You can name how fast they ran their 40. I mean, you have way too much knowledge about a team that loses a lot of games, right? Some of you could tell us how to build a house. You could tell us what tools you would need, what materials, how long it would take, how much it would cost. Some of you could tell us about your favorite TV show and everything about it. Your favorite characters, how all the characters work together, the storyline, right? We have a lot of knowledge about a lot of things. But if today I could remind you of one very simple truth that you've kind of already mentioned, is that the two most important things that we can know is, one, who is God? Who is God? And two, who am I? Who is God and who am I? Ray Vanderland has an illustration that this week I found really helpful with understanding this. He tells a story of a rabbi who's in the first century during Roman times, and he starts walking home on the dusty path in the darkness of night. Usually he doesn't go home this late. And so as he's going home, he takes a wrong turn. Instead of going left to his home, he takes a right. It's darkness, so it's kind of hard to see, right? So this rabbi is walking down this wrong path that he doesn't know is the wrong path, and he finds himself standing in front of a massive Roman fort. And so he's looking up at this building, and all of a sudden he hears a voice, a Roman soldier. And he yells from the top of that building, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" So the rabbi stopped, and he asked the soldier back, he said, "Hey, what do you get paid for asking me these questions?" And the soldier kind of paused, startled, and he said, "Well, a denarii a week, Jew." And so the rabbi said to the soldier, "I'll give you double if you stand outside my house and ask me those questions every morning when I leave. Who are you, and what are you doing here?" I love that. How would you answer those questions? Who are you, and what are you doing here? The reality is, and we've seen it in Exodus, God has already revealed who he is. But now he is going to answer and focus in on those questions. Who are you, and why are you here? Those are fundamental questions that we all have to answer. And many of us will spend our entire lives trying to figure those things out. Who am I? And why am I on this earth? But the good news is that God has already told you who you are, and he's already told you why he has put you on this earth. And for the rest of us, in the rest of our time in Exodus, he is going to unfold his plan for us, his sovereignly designed plan. And at the foundation of that plan, we're going to see as who are we and why are we here is holiness. The foundation of that plan is holiness. So think of Exodus 19 as the foundation for every other chapter that's going to follow it, okay? God is going to make his people into a holy nation, and he's doing the same with us, with his church today. Every day he is molding you. He is shaping you to live out your designed purpose. And so today, Exodus 19, this is a key chapter in the narrative. I cannot stress that enough. It probably is the most important chapter in this book. It could be one of the most important chapters in all of the Bible. Most people, when they think about the book of Exodus, they think of two moments, right? And I would guess many of us probably think this, and there's nothing wrong with this. We think of two moments when we think about the book of Exodus: the crossing of the Red Sea and the giving of the Ten Commandments, which we'll talk about next week. And so, yeah, those are two very important moments, but there are many who argue that verses 4 through 6 in Exodus 19 is actually the heart of the book of Exodus, that everything can be traced back to these three verses. And there are some that say not only are these three verses the most important verses in Exodus, but they might be the heart of the entire Bible and even the entire Old Testament. Now, chapter 19 is significant because it is a transition in the book of Exodus. Everything's going to change from here on out. And we see a transition in three different ways. The first transition is that we see the people of God go from moving to staying. So ever since they crossed the Red Sea, God's people have been on the move over and over, moving, camping. But now they have arrived at Mount Sinai. And at this mountain, they are going to stop for the better part of a year. They're going to stay at Mount Sinai. So that's one transition you see. The second transition is this chapter is a transition from freedom to faith. So God has given his people freedom from slavery, and in the next step, he is molding his people to be not only a people of freedom, but to be a people of faith, and how those two work together. The third transition that we see here is a transition of emphasis. In the first 18 chapters, there was an emphasis on who is God, God revealing himself to his people. And now the emphasis is going to be, now, because you know who I am, here's who you are. And here's who I have made you to be. Exodus 19 starts the now what part of the story. Okay, we've learned all the things that God can do and all the things that God has done for us. So now what? And we have to answer that question in our own lives. When salvation comes, freedom in our lives is experienced, guilt gone, shame gone, there comes a point when we all have to answer that question, okay, now what? God has bought me from freedom from guilt. Shame is gone. Now, what does that mean, right? What does it mean to have faith in God? That the reality is, if knowledge of God does not have an impact on who we are and what we do, then it begs the question, do we actually know the true God? Because what we know and believe about God has an impact on how we live our lives. That when we see him, when we know him, when we understand him, we can't help but have our identities shaped by what we have seen and what we know. So let's pick it up in verse 4. Let's pick it up in verse 4. Yes, this is going to be a shorter, you do that in quotation marks, shorter sermon, so we can get you out on time today. Verse 4. You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. So this is God speaking to Moses, saying, here's what you're going to tell the people. And so God wants to tell the people, you yourselves. That's how he starts it. And in Hebrew, to repeat something is to emphasize it. It's like putting bold, italics, all caps on something. You want to draw attention to this moment. And so he says, you yourselves, look at this. I want you to hear this. I'm drawing attention to this. And then he says, I crushed your enemies. I rescued you. You have seen. You know what I did. You yourselves have seen who I am. And what I have done, you saw it with your own eyes. God is making the point. I want you to remember this. And I want you to acknowledge this. He says, I bore you on eagle's wings. He's making a point. Hey, you did not contribute to what you saw or what happened. You could not rescue yourself. You weren't active in your own salvation. That was me. It's not as if you called the eagle down, jumped on its back, and helped it flap its wings. There's no Flappy Bird in the Old Testament, right? And so he says, I put you on eagle's wings. I bore you. And then he says, I brought you to myself. He says, I set my eyes on you. I brought you out of slavery, and I brought you to myself. Here's the main point, the word to remember with verse 4. You yourselves, you are a redeemed people. Remember that. To be redeemed means to buy out of, specifically to buy out of slavery. And God is making the point, you've seen it. You have seen how I moved you out of slavery, and I brought you to myself. And so if I could just remind us, believers in Christ, you have an even greater redemption than the one that we read about in Exodus. Did you know that? You have been given new life. You've moved from death to life. Christ has redeemed you out of your slavery to sin and self. Like, think about it. Think back. Remember. Some of us here can remember what life was like when we were slaves to sin. We can remember what that was like, how we used to think, the regrets and hurts that we did and experienced. And even if you're someone who, let's say you grew up in the church, and maybe you can't pinpoint an exact moment, don't be fooled. You too have experienced the great redemptive work of Christ. You can imagine what life would be like without redemption. You can imagine what thoughts you might have. You can imagine where your mind might go, because all of us have felt the sting of sin, the pain of regret, the despair of sinful choices. I think in my life, of all the times that I thought, this is the path you want me to go down, God. This is what I'm going to do. This is what's best. And God wisely and patiently over and over says, I'm not going to give you that. I'm not going to give you that. I have something that's better for you. Like, think back. Do you remember, can you actively participate with God and tell him, here's what you've done in my life? Can you remember? Do you have an idea of what God has done in you? Do you remember the experience of peace in his presence? The experience of peace when you put your trust in him. Do you remember those times when God stirred your heart and awakened something in you? Do you remember the times when you've met him in the scriptures? When you met him in the scriptures, even if today it feels very dry, right, and very difficult, but those times when he actually spoke to you. You remember those sermons or that sermon that God used, and it felt like, man, the scriptures were talking to you. No human communicator up here. This is God in his word, through the Spirit, talking to you. You remember those moments. And here's why I bring that up. I have to believe here that Moses remembers the promise, a very specific promise that God gave to him. Think back to Exodus chapter 3. Moses is in Midian, and he's talking to the Lord in the burning bush. And so let me read this to you. I have to believe that Moses remembers this. Exodus 3:12. God says, "But I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you, that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain." I love that. I wonder if Moses thought of that promise in this moment. What God has said to him. That Moses, when he was on the far side of Midian, that it was in Sinai, right? Somewhere at the foot of this same mountain, God said to him, you're going to come back here. You're going to come back to this mountain in the Sinai wilderness. You're going to go to Egypt. You're going to set my people free. But then, Moses, I'm going to bring you back here. That will be a sign for you that you can trust me. And now God has done it. He has bore him on eagle's wings. He has brought him to himself. And here's the thing that we're going to see throughout the rest of the text. When God saves you, he doesn't just bring you out. He also brings you in. So I think a lot of times as believers, and this isn't necessarily wrong, we tend to focus so much on what God has brought us out of. Because he's brought us out of sin. He's brought us, redeemed us and brought us out and secure from the wrath of God, right? But he's not only brought you out of something, he's also brought you into something, right? He didn't just say to Pharaoh, hey, let my people go. He said, let my people go that they may serve me in the wilderness. You need to let the people go, Pharaoh, because they don't serve you. They ought to serve me. If the goal was freedom in itself, then we would miss the full picture. But the goal was never freedom in itself, but freedom to worship, to serve, to have a relationship with the one true living God. We have been purchased for a purpose. So we're not only saved from something, from slavery, from sin, from the wrath of God, but we are saved to something and for someone. And I say that because many times, myself included, we can look at God's law, God's commands, his commandments, and we can tend to want to push away and rebel against obedience to God. And it's something that we don't talk about a lot because it's not fun and it's difficult and we feel guilty. But man, you come across these people, and I've had many conversations, and I've been this person in my life where I tend to see obedience as a bad thing. And where I might even say things like, well, I'm free in Christ. I'm free in Christ. Like, don't talk to me about what I should do or what I shouldn't do. I've been saved by grace. Who are you to tell me what I have to do? And while being saved by grace, that's very true, but we have to understand what grace has saved you to. Not only what it saved you from, but what grace has saved you to, that you were redeemed by God, through God, and for God. What does Paul say in Corinthians? He says, you are not your own, for you were bought with a price, right? You are someone who has not just been bought out of something, but you have been bought into something. He put you on eagle's wings, and he brought you to himself. And so remember that with verse 4. You are redeemed into something. Now look at verse 5. He says, now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenants, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. Okay, so the beginning of verse 5, he says, now therefore, if you will indeed obey. One of my things that I would get caught up on all the time, especially when I was a young believer, is I would get caught up on the ifs. If you do this, if you do this. And it was hard to understand the grace of God and works. How do these two things work together? I think a lot of times, and I'm guessing I'm not alone, that we can get caught up on the ifs of faith. Well, if you are a Christian, then you have to do this. And we begin to say, well, Christianity isn't free because I have to do something. But here's what I want you to see. To understand the if, we have to understand the therefore that comes before it. You see that therefore in verse 5? It's very important. Anytime you see the word therefore, you have to ask the question, what is it there for, right? Just a rule of thumb. There is always a therefore in the Christian life. You see it in verse 5 here. It serves as a connector. Something has happened that has changed everything in the future. So think about the New Testament. After 3 chapters of blessings and grace in Christ, Ephesians 4 begins with Paul saying, I, therefore, a prisoner of the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called. Most famously, Romans 12, after 11 chapters about what it means to be adopted, justified, chosen, born again by the mercy of God, Paul says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God. Once we understand the true therefore, then the if it feels less like a restriction and more like a gift, a joy to walk in. If you don't understand Romans 1 through 11, then you will never understand the therefore of Romans 12. And everything after it isn't going to make sense. It will feel burdensome. Obedience will feel like a restriction. But the gospel of Romans 1 through 11 is understood. When it's understood, then what comes after it is life-giving. And so don't be put off by the word if here in Exodus 19. It's actually beautiful. He says, now therefore, if you will indeed obey. God is introducing language of the covenant. This promise, this incredible promise from God that we're going to get into in the weeks to come. He's introducing, this is one of the dominant themes of the Old Testament, which is going to shape the New Testament. It's this covenant language. If you understand, therefore, if you understand that I have redeemed you, that I have crushed your enemies, I have put you on eagle's wings, I have brought you to myself. Therefore, if you obey my covenants, the rest of the book of Exodus is going to unfold the nature of that covenant. What does that mean? What does it look like to live in that therefore? It's God saying, as a redeemed people, you must obey my voice and keep my covenants. In other words, identity always leads to responsibility. God is shaping their identity, and that's going to lead to responsibility. So let me read the entirety of verse 5 again. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, he says, you shall be my treasured possession. So this is God revealing not only that we are redeemed, but that we are redeemed for a purpose. That those who are redeemed for a purpose, they obey the voice of God. They keep God's covenant. And he says, in doing this, you shall be my treasured possession. I love that. I just had to stop on that every time I read this week. Because I don't think I think of myself a lot like that. Do you? Is that natural for you? To think of yourself as God's treasured possession? I think that's weird. I mean, it's something that it's not easy for me to do. We're so quick to degrade ourselves. And even in the church, I think it's right for us to talk about total depravity and the rebellion and sin and how we are wretched and how we are sinners saved by grace. All of that is correct, but we never move to the second truth. You are God's treasured possession. We stay there. We stay what we've been bought out of, but we never move to what we've been put into, that you are God's treasured possession. And so the next time you dig a hole and you attempt to climb down that hole in self-pity, maybe take a second and remember what's actually true. That God has looked at you and he has called you his treasured possession. Isn't that amazing? He'll say it in different ways, different language in Deuteronomy 7:6. For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people of his treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. Deuteronomy 26:18, and the Lord has declared today that you are a people for his treasured possession, as he has promised you, and that you are to keep his commandments. And here's another thing. We tend to get hung up on the order of these things when we talk about the grace of God and obedience to God. We tend to get hung up on the order. Sometimes the order is, okay, you are a treasured possession, therefore you ought to be holy. That's one order. And the other order is, okay, you are to be holy and obey that you might be considered a treasured possession. Do you see the difference between those two? Right? And we tend to get hung up on, okay, what is the correct order here? But the point in the Bible, you see, is not the order. It's that they're always connected. You are to be holy as his treasured possession, and you are his treasured possession, so be holy. It's not what order is it, it's they're always connected. One is always connected to put it in theological terms, God bringing us to himself always leads to sanctification. And sanctification is always rooted in God's bringing us to himself. Those two things are always connected. Always. And that means when you fall short, when you tend to start digging that pit, when you feel guilt or shame, to be his treasured possession is to claim your sonship and to be a daughter of the one who has bought you. It's to claim your inheritance. No, I'm his treasured possession. I don't have to live in this guilt anymore. I don't have to live in this shame. I don't have to live in fear. I'm his treasured possession. And then the other way, I walk in obedience to him because I'm his treasured possession. These two things are always connected. And I love that verse 5. This is my favorite part. I love that it's just kind of tagged on at the end of verse 5. He says, for the earth is mine. Just kind of like a little random insert, right? It's not random. He says, for all the earth is mine. He makes a point. This isn't a God who is desperate to have some friends, or he likes us because he needs us. No, God has everything. He says the whole earth is his. Think about it. He's got the Grand Canyon. He's got volcanoes. He's got Hawaii. He's got Cancun, okay? He's got Rocky Mountains. I mean, he's got everything that you think is beautiful. That is all his. But he looks at you and he says, that's my treasured possession. He doesn't tell his angels, hey, look down at the Grand Canyon. He tells his angels, look down at what I'm doing. I want them to look down at the people that I've saved. And it's not only that we're a treasured people, but he calls us a priestly people, a royal priesthood. Look at verse 6. He says, you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. A kingdom of priests and a holy nation. What does it mean to be a kingdom, a priest? Well, I think one, it means that we have access, right? In the Old Testament, priests had a privileged position, a unique relationship with God, an intimacy with God, unique access to God. The priests represented the people to God in prayers and offerings, and they represented God to the people in making atonement. In other words, to be a kingdom of priests means that we are a people with a special intimacy. God is close to us, and I'm close to God. God has called me into something. What do priests do? They do intercession, they do invitation, and imitation. So intercession, invitation, and imitation. That's what it means to be a kingdom of priests. We intercede, not only for each other, but for the nations, for the world. And part of what it meant for them to be a kingdom of priests was that they were going to be set apart as a holy nation. So the nations would look and they would say, hey, well, what's going on with Israel here? Who is this God? What are they doing? Why are they doing that? Intercession. And then invitation. That they would look to the nations, they would say, I'll tell you, come and see. Come and look at my God. Let me tell you about my God. And then imitation. They set an example, stirring up the nations to see these people who have received royal, priestly honors. They have this closeness to God. They represent God to the world. That phrase, holy nation, along with the phrase kingdom of priests, those two phrases, they only occur one time together in the Old Testament. And it's right here. They appear several times in the New Testament, right? And the point is made throughout if you read through the New Testament, like Israel, we are to be distinct, set apart, and categorically different. I heard someone say it this way: holiness is a prospect and a present possession. So holiness is a prospect. It's where we're headed, but it's also a present possession. We have it right now, and that's so opposite from the world. The world says, hey, just be who you are. Just be who you are. I would say that's half right. That's half right. Because you can only be who you are when you're in your true identity, not your identity in Adam. We're giving people a false gospel when we tell them that they just have to be true to whatever they think and feel that they are. No, that's not right. The gospel says that you can only be who you are as one who is a born-again follower of Christ. The gospel says, no, I create your identity. I have called you. And holy has such a religious sound to it, we've kind of lost the beautiful meaning of that word. And sometimes we can misunderstand its intent. So let's use a couple different words, right? You are to be a royal priesthood and a different people. That's the idea. Set apart. You use paper plates, right? Because they can easily be thrown in the trash. But if you want a special dinner, you pull out that fine china. That's what you are. You're God's treasured possession. It's holy. It's not ordinary. It's peculiar. We are a peculiar people, and it's not easy to be different. It's not easy to be set apart. I mean, think about it. Who wants to think, act, believe differently than everybody else? Like, it's not easy to say to your friends, hey, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to be a part of that. I'm not going to talk like that. I'm not going to go to that place, right? No one wants to be a different person, but that is our purpose. As a redeemed people, we are to be different, set apart. I mean, think about it. Do you think it was easy for Israel? You think it was easy for Israel? Israel worshiped one God, which was at minimum strange. Everyone else worshiped multiple gods. And their gods, they could see, they could touch them. When they worshiped their gods, they could physically touch them. Israel had a God they could not see. They had to live by faith and believe that even though they could not see God, that he was there, working. The Israelites were sojourners. They had just gotten out of slavery. They were strange. They were different. God had commanded them, and we're going to see how God commanded them to be different. They were commanded to be set apart. You're not like them. You're different. And they had what could be seen as honestly arrogance from the other nations. Arrogance to believe that their God was the creator, the only creator. That they would tell these other nations, your God's not the creator. The God of Israel is. That he's my God's the sovereign one of the universe. Your God is not. And they had this arrogance to believe that they were his chosen people. But here's the thing. It's not arrogance if it's true. It's not arrogance if it's true. So they definitely didn't have it easy. And when we look around in our world, God has called us to be holy, to be different. He has redeemed us into something. 1 Peter 2:9, he says, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you might proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness and into marvelous light." The point that Peter makes is rooted in Exodus 19. God has brought you to himself. He has chosen you as his most treasured possession to be a royal priesthood, a holy nation, so that people will hear and wonder. And by the grace of God, he would bring them to himself. And he does this so that he may proclaim the excellencies of his name. See, and I'm almost done. Many times we get caught up in how do we as Christians fight the culture? I think you hear that kind of language a lot. How do we fight the culture? That we somehow believe that in the future, culture is going to overtake the throne of Christ. Like that's what's at stake. It's not. We have to remember what's true. What's true from these verses, that God has called us to be holy. He's called us to be different. We are the royal priesthood, but he is the king. We are a holy nation, but he is the holy one. We are a treasured possession, but he is the one who owns us, and he's not going to give that up. Rather than looking at our world, getting discouraged and saying, it's so hard today to be a Christian. Oh, man, the culture is just winning. We better do something. We better fight. What if we thought, what an amazing opportunity we have as the people of God? Because they're looking at us. They're looking at us and they're saying, what are you going to do? What are you going to say? How are you going to act? What are you going to post? And we as the holy, set-apart people of God, we display not who we are, but who he is to a world who desperately needs him. You wondering what the purpose of your life is? God has many things for you, but here's some that are very clear. We are a kingdom of priests. We are a holy nation. We are different. We are redeemed. We are his. God has called us to be his people, a people who reflect the heart of the king. We don't back down about what we believe and who we know to be true, but man, we display the mercy and grace and love of Christ. And we point people to him. And if I could remind you on this, there are two kingdoms active in this world right now. One will be completely destroyed, removed from this world, and one will know the eternal joy of King Jesus. One raises its fist to the throne and refuses to bend the knee, and the other side sits, or the other kingdom sits at the table of reconciliation with people who don't look like them, act like them, or talk like them, but we have one common language, that's the language of the gospel, because we've all been saved by grace at that table. Colossians 1:13 says, he has delivered us from the domain of darkness, and he has transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sin. And so please hear me, I say this with as much grace as possible. Apathy has no place in that kingdom. His people are not an apathetic people. Self-righteousness has no place in the Son's kingdom. Secret sin has no place in the Son's kingdom. You know what does? Mercy, brokenness, hurt, an admission that we can't save ourselves, but that the Son came and got me. The Son came and got me. And in grace, he has moved me from one kingdom to another. And so if I could just finish with some therefores. Therefore, you are a treasured possession. Remember that. Therefore, obey his voice. Therefore, walk in his ways. He's called you into something, and that matters. Living out the call of the gracious King as his son or his daughter. Who are you? And why has he put you here?